You have to understand, we really did try. That's the part they always forget, the part their histories will likely erase. They think we're monsters, that war is our first and only language. But it's not. We are, perhaps, the universe's most patient species. We learned the hard way that a fist is only useful if you never have to unclench it. The true power is in the handshake that never breaks. But every handshake has a limit. Every patience has an end. Our diplomat was the best of us. Not a soldier, not a politician sharpened by ambition, but a man who genuinely believed in the good in things. He had this quiet way about him. He could sit for hours with the silicon-based life forms of Cygnus-7, just listening to the low hum of their crystalline forms, finding meaning in the vibrations. He was the one who brokered the 70-year peace with the Threll, a species that communicated through color shifts and saw our verbal language as primitive shouting. He saw the universe not as a territory to be conquered, but as a garden of strange and wonderful life to be understood. He was our bridge. And they burned it. The message that came back wasn't a distress call. It was just data. A cold, clinical feed from the embassy on Xylos. Security footage, audio logs, and the final, silent biometric reading from the ambassador's own body. They didn't even have the decency to declare war. They just ended him. A calculated insult. They saw our restraint as weakness, our diplomacy as fear. They thought that by cutting off our peaceful hand, the whole body would stagger and fall. They were wrong. They had no idea what they were truly measuring with their act of violence. Back on Earth, in a room buried so deep the planet's mantle felt close, the council watched the data stream. There was no shouting. No rage-filled speeches. The room was colder than the vacuum of space. I was there, a junior strategic analyst, my job to model outcomes. I remember the face of the general. A woman with eyes like weathered granite. She didn't look angry. She looked resolved. As if a terrible, long-dreaded hypothesis had just been confirmed. She turned to the room, her voice quiet, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. The Xylos High Command has issued their statement, she said. They have chosen violence as their preferred method of discourse. Someone from the diplomatic corps, a man whose entire life's work was crumbling before him, whispered, we must send a delegation. Demand an explanation. There could have been a mistake. The mistake was theirs, the general interrupted, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. They have provided us with all the data we require. The time for explanation is over. The time for a measured response has begun. That phrase hung in the air. A measured response. It didn't sound like a call to arms. It sounded like a verdict. And that's what it was. You see, humanity's true genius isn't in our weapons, but in our preparation. For centuries, as we reached out with one hand in peace, the other hand was busy. We didn't just build starships, we built scenarios. We wargamed every possible first contact, every betrayal, every conflict. The death of an ambassador, it was Scenario 734. A grim, dark file in a vast digital library of potential futures. We knew exactly what it meant, and we knew, with chilling precision, what came next. The order wasn't, launch the fleet. It was, initiate Protocol 734. And the machine, the vast, silent, and patient machine of human military logic, began to turn. It started not with explosions, but with silence. Our listening posts across the sector went dark. Our trade routes, once buzzing with freighters, were suddenly, utterly empty. Every human vessel, every probe, every deep space beacon simply vanished from the galactic network. It was as if a great breath was being held. On Xylos, they probably celebrated. They thought they had cowed us. That we were licking our wounds in some dark corner of space. They didn't feel the subtle shift. They didn't notice the gravitational anomalies on the edge of their system, tiny ripples in spacetime that didn't match any known celestial body. They were the frog in the pot, and the water was just beginning to simmer. Our ships didn't scream into their space with guns blazing. That would have been an emotional response. A messy one. This was different. It was surgical. The first they knew of our arrival was when their power grids failed. Not all at once, but in a cascading, rolling blackout that started on their outermost colony world and swept inward, toward their homeworld, like a tide of night. Their communications died mid-sentence. Their orbital defenses powered down, their targeting systems going blind. It was a perfect, suffocating silence. I was in the command center, watching the tactical display. It was a thing of awful beauty. A ballet of absolute control. Our vessels, dark and angular, slipped into their orbits unseen, unheard. There was no declaration of war. No demands for surrender. We were simply present. A fact. A consequence. The general stood over the display, her face illuminated by the soft light of 100 star systems. Xylos was a single, pulsing red icon at the center, completely surrounded by a serene, unhurried ring of blue lights. She picked up a comms unit, her voice calm, destined for a channel we knew the Xylos leadership would be desperately scanning. "People of Xylos," she said, and her voice was like stone. "You executed our diplomat. You believe this was an act of strength. It was not. It was a miscalculation. You have forced us to shift our methodology. You have chosen to be measured by a different standard." She paused, and in that pause, you could feel the terror spreading across a world plunged into sudden, helpless darkness. This is not an invasion. This is an audit. And in that moment, staring at the screen, I realized the terrifying truth of our species. Our fury isn't a wildfire. It's a glacier. It's slow, it's inexorable, and it grinds everything in its path to dust. They killed our peacemaker. And in doing so, they awakened the cold, meticulous, and utterly ruthless accountant that lives in the heart of humanity. The water isn't just simmering now. It's beginning to boil. And they are only just starting to understand what a measured response truly means, and that for them, there will be no next part. The word audit echoed in the silent command center, a term so dry, so bureaucratic, that its use here was more terrifying than any threat of annihilation. An invasion you can understand. A battle, you can fight. But an audit? An audit is something that happens to you. It's a cold, dispassionate examination of your every flaw, your every vulnerability. It's a process where you are not a participant, but a subject. On the main display, the visual feed from the lead ship, the Steadfast, flickered to life. It showed Xylos from high orbit, a world of swirling orange and blue atmospheres now dotted with the pinpricks of city lights that were winking out, sector by sector, like a neural network being systematically silenced. There was no cheering in our command center. Just the low murmur of analysts confirming system acquisitions, their voices steady, professional. They might as well have been reading off stock market reports. That was the most chilling part of it all, the utter normality. The general lowered the comms unit. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. She turned to me, her granite eyes seeming to look right through my screen. "Status of the cultural archives," she asked, her voice low. I swallowed, my throat dry. My part in this wasn't about weapons or power grids. My assignment was Scenario 734, Subsection Delta, Societal Integration Post-Compliance. In simple terms, I was a historian. My job was to understand why they did it. To sift through the ashes of their culture and find the moment they decided murder was a valid diplomatic tool. "The planetary data stream is secured, General," I said, my fingers flying across the console. "We're bypassing their public networks and tapping directly into their deep historical servers. The translation algorithms are running. We should have the first packets decrypted shortly." She gave a single, slow nod. "Find the precedent." There's always a precedent. No species becomes this arrogant without a history of getting away with it. That was the core of Protocol 734. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about correction. A permanent one. We had learned, from our own bloody past on Earth, that you don't just defeat an enemy. You have to understand the sickness in their culture that created the enemy in the first place. And then you have to cut it out. The first data packets began to flood my screen. It was a chaotic mess of Xylosian glyphs and symbols, now being neatly translated into English by our AI. I started to read, and a cold knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't military strategy or political manifestos. It was art, poetry, philosophical texts. And it was all about the concept of the unworthy peace. A Xylosian poet, from 1,000 of their years ago, wrote of a peace brokered with a neighboring species as a stain upon their honor, a compromise that had weakened their spirit. Their greatest philosopher argued that true strength was only proven by dominating a weaker opponent so completely that conflict never even became a thought in their mind. The death of an envoy wasn't a crime to them, it was a statement. A final, unequivocal message: you are beneath negotiation. They hadn't killed our diplomat because they were angry or scared. They had killed him because, in their cultural calculus, he was irrelevant. His existence was an insult to their worldview. Sending him was, to them, an act of profound disrespect. We were the ones who had broken the rules, by believing there were any rules at all. General, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'm seeing a pattern. It's ideological. They see diplomacy itself as a sign of weakness. She came to stand behind me, looking over my shoulder at the scrolling text. So they forced our hand. They wanted to see the monster they believed was hiding behind the handshake. And we're giving it to them, I replied, a hollow feeling in my chest. No, she corrected softly. We are giving them the truth. The monster isn't our rage. The monster is our patience. They have no framework for this. They understand conquest. They don't understand consequence. Down on Xylos, the silence was breaking. But not with the sounds of war. It was breaking with a single, repeated message, broadcast on every frequency we had left open to them. It was from the Xylosian High Command. The translation software rendered the voice of their leader as high-pitched, frantic, stripped of all its former arrogance. Human command vessel. This is an outrage. You have violated our sovereignty. State your demands. We are a proud species. We will not be treated like subjects. The general didn't move. She let the message play out, a desperate rant that lasted for 3 full minutes. When it was over, the silence that followed was even heavier. She keyed the comms again, her voice unchanged, that same calm, relentless tone. Xylosian High Command. Your sovereignty was forfeit the moment you executed our representative. You speak of pride. We are not interested in your pride. We are interested in your accounting. On a secondary screen, a list began to populate. It was a list of names. Xylosian names. The political leaders, the military commanders, the ideological architects of their current regime. Next to each name was a date, a time, and a location. Their locations. We knew where every single one of them was hiding. The following individuals, the general continued, her voice filling the dead airwaves of a paralyzed world, are required for debriefing. You have one of your planetary rotations to surrender them to the coordinates we are now transmitting. This is not a negotiation. The message ended. The silence returned. This was the next phase. The isolation was complete. The power was gone. Now, we were demonstrating our omniscience. We were showing them that we could see everything, that their leaders were not hidden, but exposed. We were turning their own people against them, presenting a simple, terrible choice: hand over the architects of this disaster, or share in their fate. I looked at the faces of my colleagues around the room. Some were pale. Some had tears silently tracking down their cheeks. We weren't soldiers. We were scholars, engineers, diplomats. We were the people who had built the handshake. And now, we were the ones operating the machinery of this terrible, measured response. We were dismantling a civilization not with bombs, but with facts. It was the most humane form of war ever devised, and it felt more cruel than anything I could have imagined. The general returned to her command chair, her gaze fixed on the planet below. They will try something desperate now, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. A cornered animal, especially a proud one, always does. She was right. We had taken their power, their communication, their pride. There was only one thing left for them to use. The one variable that Protocol 734 could model but never truly predict. The wild card of sheer, stupid, hopeless defiance. The alert was soft, a single chime on the tactical officer's console. His voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. General. We have a launch. Single signature. High energy yield. It's a suicide trajectory. Origin, the Xylosian home defense silo, deep beneath their capital city. Target, the Steadfast. The general didn't flinch. She simply leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the screen where a tiny, bright dot was now rising from the orange atmosphere of Xylos, a final, fiery act of refusal. Well, she said, a whisper almost lost in the hum of the ship. Let's see how they measure up to a real response. The silence in the command center shattered. It wasn't replaced by panic, but by a sudden, electric hum of focused energy. The soft beeps and murmurs sharpened into crisp, urgent reports. The tiny, bright dot rising from Xylos was no longer just a symbol of defiance, it was a physical object, packed with enough energy to tear a continent apart. A suicide run. They were going to take as many of us with them as they could. Target is accelerating. Projected impact with the Steadfast in 4 minutes, 10 seconds, the tactical officer said, his voice flat, devoid of the fear I knew must be clawing at his throat. On the screen, the Steadfast, our flagship, hung in orbit, a silent, dark sentinel. It made no move to evade. It just waited. The general didn't shout orders. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the console, her knuckles white. Confirm the yield, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Yield is extreme, General. It's a planet-killer grade warhead. They're targeting the Steadfast, but the blast radius would glass most of their own northern hemisphere. The officer looked up, his face ashen. They're willing to sacrifice millions of their own people just to land a single blow. A cold fury settled in my gut. This was the sickness. This was the ideological poison I'd read about in their texts. Pride so absolute it valued a statement over survival. They would rather become a footnote in a cosmic tragedy than admit they were wrong. General, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to control it. This is the precedent. The unworthy peace. They see any outcome other than total victory or total annihilation as a stain. This is them choosing annihilation. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on the trajectory of the missile, a line of red light crawling across the star map towards the blue icon of our ship. Then we must show them there is a third option, she replied. One they haven't considered. 3 minutes to impact, Tactical announced. On the surface, the Xylosian leadership would be watching, hoping for a miracle, or perhaps hoping for a clean end to their shame. They had thrown a spear at a glacier, expecting it to shatter. They didn't understand that the glacier doesn't react to the spear. It simply continues its advance. Activate Point Defense Protocol Ares, the general said. Her command was not a roar, but a statement of fact. But it wasn't what any of us expected. Ares wasn't a laser system or an interceptor missile. On the main display, a new window opened. It showed a schematic of the Xylosian missile, its internal systems laid bare by our sensors. Our AI was already inside its computer brain. "Protocol Ares is a surgical strike, Lieutenant," the general said, as if reading my mind. "We don't blow it up. We simply convince it to stand down." The translation software was now working on the missile's own internal communication. It was a simple, repeating signal. Target acquired. Commitment confirmed. Glory to Xylos. The mantra of a machine on a death wish. 2 minutes. Our response was not an explosion. It was a data packet. A single, compressed stream of information fired from the Steadfast directly into the missile's guidance system. For a long second, nothing happened. The missile continued its climb, a determined star of death. Then, the signal from the missile changed. The Glory to Xylos message stuttered. It was replaced by a new, looping transmission. The translation appeared on my screen, and my blood ran cold. It was a live feed. A video of the Xylosian capital city, taken from one of our high-resolution drones. The feed showed the silent, darkened streets. It zoomed in, through a window, into the bunker where we knew the High Command was hiding. We could see them, huddled around a screen, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and terror. The missile's new target coordinates were now synced to this live feed. It was being shown its creators. The message looping in its simple computer brain was now, target reacquired. New objective, source of launch. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't war. This was psychological dissection. We had turned their ultimate weapon into a mirror and forced them to look into it. 1 minute to impact, the tactical officer said, his voice a hoarse whisper. On the screen, the missile didn't turn. It didn't need to. Its trajectory was already taking it back down. The Xylosian leaders, watching from their bunker, would now see their own doom rising to meet them, a creation of their own pride coming home to roost. The sheer, terrifying poetry of it was overwhelming. This was the audit. This was the consequence. We were holding up a ledger showing them the exact, mathematical outcome of their actions. The general stood perfectly still. Open a channel to the bunker. Visual and audio. A screen flickered to life. The faces of the Xylosian High Command filled the display. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by a primal, horrified understanding. They could see the missile's track on their own screens. They could see the face of their own death. The leader stared into our camera, his eyes wide with a terror so complete it was almost peaceful. He had finally measured the distance between his ambition and our response, and found it to be 0. The general looked at him, her expression not of hatred, but of a profound, weary sadness. "You sought to measure our strength," she said, her voice echoing in the silence of their bunker. "You have your measurement." On the main display, the red dot of the missile reached the apex of its climb. For a heartbeat, it hung there in the darkness of space, poised between humanity and the world that had dared to kill our peace. And then it began to fall. The missile fell. It wasn't a slow, dramatic arc. It was a precise, gravity-assisted plunge, a stone dropped into the well of a planet's gravity. In the command center, the only sound was the hum of the life support and the frantic, ragged breathing of the Xylosian leaders on the comm screen. They were begging now, their translated pleas a messy jumble of offers, denials, and raw, animal fear. They promised anything, unconditional surrender, resources, their own lives. The general listened, her face a mask of stone. She said nothing. Her silence was the most terrifying sound of all. It was the sound of a verdict already passed. I couldn't watch the leaders. My eyes were fixed on the trajectory plot. The red dot screamed through the upper atmosphere, leaving a fiery scar across the planet's face. It was heading right for the heart of their capital, right for the bunker. This was it. The final, terrible conclusion. The ultimate proportional response. An eye for an eye, a world shattered for a single life taken. But then, something impossible happened. At 10,000 meters above the target, the missile stopped. It didn't explode. It didn't veer off course. It simply arrested its descent with an elegance that defied physics, hanging in the air like a malevolent star. The fiery glow of re-entry cooled, revealing the sleek, dark shape of the weapon they had built. It was now just waiting. The begging from the bunker ceased, replaced by a confused, static-filled silence. They had seen their death arrive, and then it had simply paused to look at them. The general finally moved. She leaned slightly towards the comms. "Your weapon has achieved stable hover," she said, her voice still that same, calm, analytical tone. It was the understatement of the century, a comment so dry it sucked the air from the room. "It is awaiting final authorization." On the screen, the Xylosian leader stared, his face a mess of tears and confusion. "Authorization? What authorization? You have us. You've won. This is torture." "This is not torture," the general corrected, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not anger, but a profound, cosmic weariness, showed in her eyes. "This is a clarification. You launched a weapon you believed would grant you an honorable death in battle. You believed it would be a final, defiant act. We are simply demonstrating that even your defiance is not your own to command." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to a technician across the room. A new window opened on the main display. It was a live feed from the missile itself. The camera was pointing down, showing a crystal-clear, magnified view of the bunker's roof. We could see the individual seams in the reinforced concrete, the vents, the panic of tiny figures scurrying below. Then, the feed split. The second half of the screen showed a different location. A vast, underground cavern, bathed in a soft, green light. It was filled with row upon row of crystalline pods, each one pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light. Inside each pod was a Xylosian child. Thousands of them. The next generation, hidden away in a secret ark, a shelter designed to survive even a global catastrophe. The Xylosian leader on the comms screen made a choked, guttural sound. The existence of that ark was their species' most closely guarded secret. Their ultimate hope. "The preservation of your species is a logical objective," the general said, her voice soft as falling snow. "We have no quarrel with them. But your leadership, the ideology that led to this moment, is a contagion. It cannot be allowed to spread." She paused, letting the horror of the situation sink in, not just for them, but for all of us watching. "The missile you built is now linked to two targets. The bunker where you hide. And the ark where your future sleeps. Its programming is quite simple. It will strike one, and only one." The silence in our command center was absolute. We had thought we were administering a punishment. We had thought the audit was complete. We were wrong. This was something else. This was forcing them to participate in their own judgment. "The authorization code," the general continued, "will be provided by you." The Xylosian leader stared, his mind clearly breaking under the strain. "You want me to choose? To choose which target to destroy? That is monstrous." The general's reply was immediate, and it carried the weight of 1,000 years of human history. "Monstrous? You executed an unarmed man who offered you peace. You launched a planet killer at a civilian vessel, willing to sacrifice millions of your own. You defined the terms of this engagement. We are merely using your own currency." She leaned closer to the screen, her gaze boring into the broken leader. "This is your final entry in the ledger. You will choose the target. You will decide if your pride is worth the extinction of your bloodline, or if your legacy will be the survival of the innocent you sought to protect. This is not our choice. It is yours. It has always been yours." She leaned back. "You have 60 seconds to transmit the authorization code and the target coordinates. The missile is waiting." And there it hung. The weapon they had built to express their absolute defiance had become the instrument of their ultimate moral audit. It was no longer a tool of war, but a question. A single, terrible question about the true value of a twisted ideology. The clock on the main display began to count down from 60. Each passing second was a lifetime. The Xylosian leaders on the screen were no longer begging. They were just staring at each other, their faces hollowed out by an impossible decision. The stakes were no longer about victory or defeat. They were about the very soul of their species. And we, the silent, patient auditors, waited for their answer. The 60-second clock ticked down, each digit a hammer blow against the silence. On the calm screen, the Xylosian leaders were crumbling. Their grand speeches, their fierce pride, it all melted away in the face of this impossible choice. They weren't warriors anymore. They were just terrified beings staring into an abyss of their own making. 45 seconds. The leader, the one who had spoken with such arrogance, looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The instruments that had signed the death warrant for a diplomat were now being asked to sign the death warrant for their entire future. There was a terrible poetry to it, a balance so horrifying it felt less like justice and more like a curse. 30 seconds. A younger official, his face streaked with whatever passed for tears on Xylos, suddenly lunged for the console. We choose the Ark. Save the children. It is the only. He was wrestled to the ground by his own comrades. The bunker descended into chaos, a scuffle of limbs and desperate shouts. They were fighting over the right to choose their own extinction. The ideology of the unworthy peace was turning on itself, devouring its followers in its death throes. 15 seconds. The head leader looked up from the fray, his eyes meeting the generals through the screen. All the fight was gone. There was only a hollow, devastating understanding. He knew. He finally knew the true cost of the ledger. He opened his mouth to speak, to give the command that would end his own life. The general raised a single hand. Stand by. The command was quiet, but it froze everyone, both in the bunker and in our command center. The clock hit 5 seconds, 4, 3, and then it stopped. A collective, shuddering breath seemed to run through the room. I realized I'd been holding mine. Xylos was not an isolated incident, she said. It was a symptom. A symptom of a galaxy that has grown comfortable with the idea that humanity is a patient, peaceful power. A harmless curiosity. She turned to face us, and the weight of centuries was in her gaze. The death of our diplomat was not just a crime. It was a data point. It proved that our message of peace has been misinterpreted as weakness. To prevent another Xylos, we must correct this misinterpretation. Not just here, but everywhere. My blood ran cold. The scope of it was unimaginable. Protocol 734 was never just about a single planet, the general said, her words falling like stones. It was a contingency for the moment we would have to redefine our relationship with the entire galactic community. The measured response does not end with the punishment of a single offender. It continues with the education of all potential offenders. On the giant star map, the amber lights began to pulse. Each one was a species, a civilization that had, according to our deep-range analysts, similar expansionist, predatory ideologies. Each one was a future Xylos waiting to happen. The audit of Xylos was the final proof of concept, she said. It worked. Now, we take that proof on the road. She entered a final command. Across the galaxy, in the dark, silent void, our hidden fleets, vessels built not for war but for the delivery of inescapable consequences, began to power up. They had been waiting, sleeping for generations, for this exact moment. The message will be simple, the general said, her voice the calm, terrible center of the coming storm. The handshake remains open. But from this day forward, the galaxy will understand the true strength of the hand that offers it. The screen filled with the image of a single human hand, open, as if for a handshake. Then, slowly, the fingers curled inward, not into a fist, but into a posture of precise, unshakable control. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The response was over. The lesson was just beginning. The command center was utterly silent. The hum of the ship's systems, which had been a constant, unnoticed presence, now felt like a deafening roar. The general's words hung in the air, not as a shout, but as a quiet, fundamental change in the universe. The hand on the screen, fingers curled with deliberate control, wasn't a symbol of aggression. It was a symbol of a door closing. The era of hopeful, naive outreach was over. A new chapter had begun, and we were the ones turning the page. On the main display, the star map with its dozens of pulsing amber lights was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Xylos hadn't been the end. It had been the first lesson in a curriculum we were about to teach the entire galaxy. The proportional response was not an end point, it was a policy. I looked around at the faces of my colleagues. The relief I'd felt moments before had vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The historian who had found the unworthy piece texts looked pale, her hands trembling slightly on her console. The tactical officer who had tracked the missile stared at the star map as if seeing his own future, an endless series of silent, terrifying confrontations. We had all signed up to build bridges. Now, we were being told we were the guardians of the moat. The general saw it in our eyes. The shock. The fear. The moral vertigo. She didn't dismiss it. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She sat down, not in her command chair, but on the edge of a nearby console, making herself smaller, more human. "I know what you're feeling," she said, her voice losing its command center edge, becoming quieter, almost personal. "You feel like we've become the monsters they accused us of being. That this, grand plan, is a betrayal of everything the diplomats stood for." She was right. The thought had been screaming in my head. The man who valued peace above all else, and we had used his death as a pretext for a galactic-scale demonstration of power. "But ask yourselves," she continued, her gaze sweeping over us. "What did he die for? He died because his message of peace was mistaken for weakness. He died because his open hand was seen as an invitation for a knife. If we simply mourn him and continue as before, then his death is meaningless. It happens again. On another world. To another good man or woman." She pointed a finger at the frozen image of the Xylosian bunker. "What we did here today was not vengeance. It was surgery. We removed a cancerous ideology without destroying the patient. The Xylosian people will wake up tomorrow to a new reality. Their warmongering leaders are gone. Their war machine is disabled. But their children are safe. Their cities are intact. They have been given a chance to rebuild, to learn a better way. That is the proportional part of the response. It is measured not by the pain we inflict, but by the future we allow to continue." She stood up again, her posture straightening, the general returning. "The galaxy is a dark forest. For centuries, we have been lighting candles, hoping others would be drawn to the light. But we have learned that the light only attracts predators if there is no consequence for attacking it. So now, we must show them that the hand that holds the candle is also the hand that holds the shield. That the light we offer is protected by a strength they cannot comprehend." The orders began to flow, but they were different now. They weren't about targeting or weaponry. They were about administration. A team of cultural analysts, linguists, and historians, people like me, were tasked with drafting the first contact clarification. It was a dry, bureaucratic title for the most profound shift in human foreign policy in history. It stated, in clear, unambiguous terms, that humanity desired peaceful coexistence. It outlined frameworks for trade, scientific exchange, and cultural dialogue. But it also contained a single, stark clause, now known as the Xylos precedent. It stated that any act of violence against a human diplomatic envoy would be considered a unilateral rejection of peace, and would be met with an immediate and irreversible proportional response. The message wasn't a threat. It was a fact. A law of nature, as immutable as gravity, that we were now writing into the fabric of interstellar relations. Over the following weeks, I watched as our silent fleets, the ones we never knew existed, moved into position near the amberlit systems. There were no grand announcements, no shows of force. It was a quiet, deliberate positioning. A presence. The message was sent not as a broadcast, but through secure, untraceable channels directly to the ruling bodies of each species. It was delivered not with a snarl, but with the calm finality of a judge passing sentence. We monitored their communications. The reaction was not what I expected. There was no unified outrage. Instead, there was a stunned, fearful silence, followed by frantic, encrypted diplomatic traffic between the various powers. They weren't planning a united front against us. They were scared. They were looking at the fate of Xylos, a powerful, arrogant empire brought to its knees without a single shot being fired in anger, and they were recalculating their entire understanding of the universe. The bully of the galaxy had just been effortlessly subdued by the quiet, unassuming neighbor they'd always ignored. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been fundamentally rewritten. One day, I was in the archives, reviewing the final logs from our diplomat's personal effects. There was a video file, a personal recording he'd made the night before his death. I'd avoided it, the pain too fresh. But now, I felt I had to watch it. His face filled the screen. He looked tired, but there was a gentle warmth in his eyes. He was speaking to his family back on Earth, telling them about the Xylosian art he'd seen, the complexity of their music. They are a proud people, he said, a small smile on his lips. And pride can make you fearful. It can make you see a offered hand as an insult. But I believe, deep down, that every species has a desire for more than just survival. They have a desire for connection. We just have to be patient enough to find the key. He paused, looking directly into the camera, his expression turning serious. But we must never be naive. A light in the darkness is a beautiful thing, but it must be built on a foundation that cannot be shaken. True peace is not the absence of strength. It is the presence of a strength so profound, so absolute, that conflict becomes unthinkable. I stopped the video. My breath caught in my throat. He had known. On some level, the best of us had understood the terrible truth we had just been forced to enact. Peace was not a default state. It was a fortress that had to be built and defended, every single day. I went to find the general. She was in her ready room, staring out a viewport at the star-dusted blackness. I saw his last message, I said quietly. She didn't turn. And he understood. He knew that our patience had to be backed by something unbreakable. She finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of the burden she carried. The grief. The loneliness of command. He was a better man than I, she said. He believed the key was always there. I have come to believe that sometimes, you have to forge the key yourself, and in the process, change the lock. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the stars. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, turning back to the viewport, we wait. We hold the line. We continue to offer the open hand. But now, the galaxy will look at that hand and they will not see weakness. They will see the hand that held the Xylosian missile in the sky. They will see the hand that offered their children a future. They will see strength and mercy, woven together so tightly you cannot have one without the other. That is the lesson. That is the true measured response. The story of Xylos became a quiet legend. Not a story of glorious battle, but a somber tale of cause and effect. On Earth, life went on. People lived, loved, and dreamed under skies untroubled by war, protected by a legacy of quiet strength they would never fully comprehend. And out in the dark, between the stars, humanity waited. Not as conquerors, but as guardians. The patient gardeners of a peace we had paid a terrible price to secure. We had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes, the only way to preserve the light is to be willing to become the unshakable darkness that surrounds it. The handshake remained open. But the galaxy finally understood the immeasurable strength of the arm that offered it. The response was over. The peace, a real and lasting peace, had finally begun.